for that amazing and moving song. It's one reason why I really, really like being a part of this place. What a rich morning we've had already. Thanks, Mary, for that meditation. I feel like I don't know if I can really add too much to the depth that's already been shared. I was thinking about this story in the Gospels. Jesus lands at this village called Bethsaida. I was just there a few weeks ago, in fact. And he gets out of the boat, and there's a blind guy, and he spits and makes some mud, as you do, and puts it on the man's eyes. And then says, "What do you see?" He says, "I see trees like people walking around." So he gets to work again and makes some more mud with saliva and puts it on the man's eyes. And then he asks the man again, and the man says, I see clearly. And the disciples are kind of confused, as I'm kind of confused, like thinking about that story. What's going on? Especially if you're like a fan of Jesus or something, or like a Christian, you might think, hey, what's going on? I mean, did you lose your, didn't check your healing booklet before, wasn't sure of the ratio to saliva to mud? What's going on? It's an odd story. And actually, a number of years ago, I was with a scholar named John Dominic Crossan. Maybe you've heard of him. He's quite well known. And I got to spend 3 days with him and his wife, and we were talking about some of these stories. And he said to me, he's like, you know what? If you ask a question like, did this really happen? Your choices are either it happened or it didn't happen. That's about it. And if you take a story like that and you ask, hey, did this really happen? Then you think to yourself, well, it either did or it didn't. I guess there's your choice. But if you say, I'm not really sure if this happened, then you have to ask, well, then why is it there? And why is it there in this form? Because as you well know, the Gospels were edited and written many, many years later. So why include such an odd story, right? Why not just clean it up and be like, oh yeah, I made some mud and saliva and then boom, it was magic and it worked. Why put in this little slip up if that's what it is? And it turns out that this story fits within a whole theme around blindness. It seems to be one of Jesus's major concerns about blindness. And I think it's worth asking why. Why is this the case? And what was compelling about it? So I thought I'd start off with that story because I want to talk about Jesus for the next few times that I'm teaching. So if you have a Jesus hangover, I'm sorry. Come anyway, and then it'll give you something to get fired up about on the way home. And here's why. I actually mentioned this a few weeks ago here, but I was watching the news during this Roy Moore business, and a pastor said, well, it's interesting, he said of Roy Moore, he's like, he was falsely accused just like Jesus. And I thought to myself, all right, let's talk about that. Let's talk about Jesus. If Jesus as a cultural image is being co-opted by all kinds of political parties and ideas, let's talk about it. Instead of saying, I'd rather ignore that and pretend that really didn't happen, which is sort of my tendency, let's just take a look at that and say, what's going on? What about Jesus? And here's another question I have that's sort of hovering around in my mind. Jung talks about archetypal symbols and images. And he talks about really powerful archetypal symbols and images lasting many hundreds, if not thousands of years. A good example of that is the image of Jesus. It's a big, powerful, compelling, rich image that has lasted for a couple thousand years. But he also says, and the cycles tend to run out and lose their power. And his sort of wink and nod is, that's the age that we're in now. Some of these big symbols that have influenced, particularly Western history, some of their symbolic power, it's losing its steam. And my question is that really the case? What's going on with Jesus? So that's what I want to talk about in the next few weeks. And I want to start by saying I think there are 4 Jesuses.
It's losing its steam.
Okay, 4 of them. I'll try to describe them briefly.
And my question is that really the case? What's going on with Jesus?
The American Jesus.
So that's what I want to talk about in the next
The guy
weeks.
who shows up
and I want to start by
holidays,
saying I think there are 4
sometimes he's got a flag with him. He's the American Jesus. And, of course, the American flag, not just any flag. And where did we get this idea? Actually, we did not invent it. Our country was founded, really, with a kind of American Jesus, thanks to the Puritans. And by the way, Puritan was at first a term of condemnation. That's what the Europeans called the overly zealous Protestants, Puritans. They're trying to get everything pure. And they weren't the first tier. The first tier were really looking for gold, believe it or not. But 100 years later, here come the influx of Puritans. And they brought with them a lot of interesting biblical imagery. They said, this is the New Jerusalem. There were articles in the newspapers in Europe about Georgia being on the same latitude as the Garden of Eden, as Palestine, and therefore this might be the Garden of Eden. And we're coming here, and it's a wilderness, but just like the Israelites, we're going to go through the wilderness and we're going to take the promised land. This is in our cultural and historical DNA if you are non-native. You can say, oh, that's not me. I'm saying it's you. It's built into a kind of our mythology around Jesus, in fact. Like sometimes you think about Joseph Smith claiming he found these tablets and that Jesus had come here and preached to the natives and there was a lost tribe of Israel. You think, that sounds kind of made up. But that was already 150 years of something like that being passed around in the culture. In fact, the Puritans said that Europe was overly Christianized for a while, till it got corrupt. And during that time period, the demons flew over the ocean and landed here in America and inhabited Native Americans, and that's why it's okay to kill one. Okay? So thank you, American Jesus, for giving us the power to come here and do what we want, right? So when political leaders and religious leaders talk about Jesus today in the 21st century, we have a whole history of a kind of mythology or maybe propaganda associated with this Jesus. And now Jesus, as you well know, is also into pop culture. He really likes giving Grammys. He says, I've kind of got my favorites. And he's really into sports teams. And you probably didn't know this. This is in one of the lost Gospels. But just after the Beatitudes, he says, make sure you also kneel in the end zone in the future when football gets invented. Because that was one of his major concerns. And we all seem to be kind of comfortable and uncomfortable with this. It's weird. And, of course, people are, whether or not they're very religious or not, say things like, God bless America, we're praying for you. And even if they're not, it's all mixed up in the culture. That's the American Jesus. And he didn't just come out of the blue. He came out of Europe. He came out of Western Christianity largely, and came out of a Protestant version of Christianity largely. In fact, by the way, the Puritans also claimed that this is so absurd, but that the French and the Indians were together trying to make war against the saints, meaning the Pope, the French, the Pope, which is the Antichrist, according to the Puritans, and the Native Americans and their demons are together, and that's why we can make war against them. Yeah, now we have French fries. It's a weird world, times change. But I think it's important just to acknowledge there is such a thing as an American Jesus. That's Jesus number 1. Okay? Jesus number 2 is the Jesus of church history. And we don't have time for that Jesus because that's really complicated. The Jesus of church history is actually split into 2 different Jesuses, and that's the Eastern Orthodox Jesus, who if you met, you'd be like, huh? And then there's the Western Jesus, which is Catholicism, and then it's split off cousin of Protestantism, and it's 30,000 denominations. That's the Jesus of church history. It is very much institutional. It's iconic. There are icons, there are symbols, there are doctrines and creeds, and And there's a big mixture of politics and religion, as there always have been, but that's the Jesus of church history. And it's important to keep in mind when you start thinking about Jesus as a symbol, as an image. And then beneath that, third Jesus, is the historical Jesus, which is the great gift of the scholarship of the last 150 years. People didn't talk about the historical Jesus 1,000 years ago or 50. They didn't. They weren't like, hey, remember Jesus was Jewish and he spoke Hebrew? And they were like, what? No, I thought he was like the Pope. Didn't happen. We had sort of cleaned up. The church history Jesus tried to eradicate all Jewishness. That's the great gift of, like I said, contemporary scholarship. And it is having, I think, in my personal view, a positive effect on the church itself and on people's images of Jesus. It's starting to change. We're collectively becoming a little more uncomfortable with Jesus waving an American flag, This is so weird. When I was a student in Israel, I went to graduate school there. We went out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee with a professor to do scholarship. We're looking at texts and we're out on the lake. And the Israelis who run these little companies, tourist companies, they just did what all these tourist companies normally do. We get out there and all of a sudden they hit play and on comes the national anthem, the American national anthem, and these Israelis are raising the flag on the boat. And we're standing there as students like, what is happening? And irony of ironies, it was the day that the Iraq War started. Yeah, so how's that for weirdness? Yeah, that was a strange time. I just remembered that story. So anyway, let me recover. So the historical Jesus is challenging some of these notions. And we're starting to say things like, he was Jewish. He didn't speak English. Amazing, I know. It wasn't the King James English. I know, it's hard to imagine. And by the way, between the Jesus of church history and the historical Jesus sit the Gospels. They're not quite down on the level of the historical Jesus, because Jesus didn't write them. They're written many decades afterwards. But they're not quite institutionally church. There is no church, really, when they're written as an institution. So they sit somewhere in the middle. And they have multiple layers. And then the fourth Jesus. And the fourth Jesus is a question, really, that I have. And it's a hint, a guess I have, that there's also a kind of mystical or cosmic or non-dual or transcendent Jesus in there too. That's the fourth Jesus. I think it's connected to the historical Jesus as a person, but what I mean as a teacher of transformation and change, I think it's there. And I'm actually interested as to whether or not that Jesus, the more mystical, mythic, cosmic Jesus, still has the power to transform and change our present situation. That's a question I have, because everybody's using him, but I get the feeling maybe not the mystical Christ. He's been co-opted as an American Jesus, is what I'm saying. So what I want to do is look at some of the teachings just over the next few weeks and allow them to shine light, if possible, on who we are and where are we. And are there some little like dandelion seeds like floating out there that might be planted again in some fertile soil? And there is fertile soil. The world seems to be in a fairly desperate state. Would you agree with that? It seems to be in a very tribal state. Would you agree with that? I was thinking about that when people are saying, we should put Christ back in Christmas. I think to myself, does he want to be there? Is he like, thank you? He's probably like, I don't want anything to do with this craziness. So anyway, let me read you something. Let me find it from Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton's a very interesting fellow. This is what he says. If Christ stays at the tribal level, then it just might destroy the world. So we're not messing around. Listen to that again. If Christ, and let's just throw in the American Jesus, stays at the tribal level, it just might destroy the world. You hear that in like Bob Dylan's song, with God on our side. God wants us to do this. And now we're getting into a state where we actually have the capacity to destroy the world. Every living creature, just about. So that's why it's worth talking about. You say, why would you talk about Jesus? Because if we don't, it just might destroy the world. If we allow Jesus just to remain on the tribal level. Then he also says this. If those within it move to the mystical level, then it can transform the world. And that's a question I have. A part of me thinks, yeah, that's true. And there are rays of hope all around. There really are. Thomas Merton is one of them. I know he's no longer with us, but he's one of those people who I think in his own small way tried to move to the mystical level and he really transformed the spiritual landscape of America in a very subtle way. If you don't know who Thomas Merton is, Google. So that's why I want to talk a bit about Jesus over the next few weeks. And I'll try to take a few of his teachings and see how they might speak to us. Let me say one more thing here. And the one of the commandments, make no graven image. You're familiar with this? This is more of an observation. I'm not the first one to point this out, but what seems to be happening now is that it's a kind of reversal. We create God in our own image. And that's true of Jesus. We create Jesus in our own image. And my question is that helpful anymore? Or is it time to admit that we have largely, it's been a consolidation or a kind of projection that we've been bringing together of our own values and assumptions and calling that, at least if you're a Christian, calling that God. And might there be a way back? Might there be a way back, a way to allow this sort of thing to unravel a bit? Okay. So, let's talk about blindness. As I said before, major theme in the stories around Jesus. In fact, there's another one where there's a blind man on the side of the road. I think in the city of Jericho, if I'm not mistaken. And he's calling out. You know what Jesus says to him when he stops? He says, "What do you want me to do?" That's a very interesting way of responding. What do you want me to do? And another place he says, "Do you want to get well?" What do you want me to do? I think that's a very conversational way of putting the question back on the person asking for help. Jesus wants to have a kind of conversation. What is it that you want? Jesus is getting at. And if we start thinking on the more mythic or mystical level, what do you really want? I mean, what do you really, really want? I mean, if I were to ask you that question, what would you say? What do you want? Or if we could go back in time, what do you want for Christmas? Really? That's what you really want. You really want, I don't know. What did you get for Christmas? Give me something. Socks. That was it. Yeah. Actually, you may have really wanted socks. What I really want on the soul level are socks. What is it that you want? That's a powerful and I think rich way of responding. So Jesus keeps bumping into blind people and engages them in conversation and occasionally heals them. And in the story we started with, kind of half heals them and then kind of maybe cleans up the mess afterwards. We can't have people going around who think trees are people and people are trees. What would happen if the world was like that? So these are just sort of some major themes with Jesus. So let's just make an observation. The problem is not being able to see in these stories. Would you agree with that? The problem is not being able to see. So what's the problem then? Not being able to see. So what's the problem already on the mythic soul level? We can't see. We can't see. And is that not what life is like? I'll give you an example. November, when's the election again? The 6th? The 8th? No, I mean just like every, the 4-year presidential election is on what day? Whatever. See, like Mary, I'm not good with dates, I mean, what's a date, I just live in the seasons. So, in the month of November last year, when it was announced that Trump would be the president, I was surprised. I know I was one of the few that was surprised, but I felt like I couldn't see. And I was blind up until that moment. And I mean, when I say blind, totally blind. I believe the Huffington Post, it said, we give Trump 1.3% chance of winning. I was like, yeah, that's right. I was that blind. And that, I think, is a metaphor, is what I'm saying. What else am I blind? And that's what was like disturbing on the existential level. How blind am I right now? And it wasn't like I was blind, but now I see. It was just like, I just know that I'm blind. That's what I think these healings are about. Why? I mean, you would think if Jesus was just a healer, why not pack a stadium, get everybody in there, get all the illnesses together and be like, boom, nailed it. You're all healed. But no, he picks like just one person here, another person there. Just how inefficient, you would never make it as the American Jesus. He's too inefficient. So he must be saying something by these encounters. And what is he saying? That you're blind. That we're blind. And that's why I put in that little quotation from the Pharisees. I love this because the Pharisees get kind of a bad rap in the Gospels, except if you read on a different level, on the historical, critical level, there are actually some Pharisees that are friends of Jesus. It's not so like black and white, either good or bad. They're a mixture. But Jesus is doing a teaching, and the Pharisees are kind of like surprised in a way, and they're like, what? Are you saying we're blind too? And Jesus says, if you claim to see, you're blind. Now, this is why I think this is an example that Jesus is speaking on the mystical, transcendent, trans-religious. I don't think Jesus came to start a religion. Like, it's like, Judaism, I'll just start a new one after my name. Which wasn't his name, by the way. No, I think it's an example of him. One of my favorite teachers, Richard Rohr, calls him the first non-dual teacher of the West. There are lots of non-dual teachers before, like Buddha. But he's the first non-dual teacher of the West, even though he's really in the Orient, I suppose. But he cuts through, and he's interested in how people see the world. How do you see? And in other words, what is reality? What is true? And we walk around blind much of the time. And the people who are the most blind are the religious people. And if you live in a country that statistically is very religious, America, you would think you would encounter a lot of blind people, which seems to be the case, including me. And that's what makes Jesus tricky, because you're like, oh yeah, that's right, he's picking on the Pharisees. No, he's picking on you. He's picking on me. And he wants people to see. That's what's like powerful about it too. He wants people to see. But he puts it on them. Do you want to see or not? Do you want to get well? Do you want the blinders to come off? I do. God, I do. But it requires, like Mary's saying in her meditation, a tremendous amount of humility to say, I don't see. Facebook is not a great place for admitting that you don't see. Facebook is a great place for saying, I see and nobody else does. And basically all of social media with it. It's part of the medium. You know, it's not like people aren't competing on Twitter for humility, you know. Seems to serve the opposite, you know. So I think just in this one sense, the more mystical, which I think is connected to the historical Jesus too, seems to rise up in the middle of this pervasive American Jesus culture and seems to be, at least on one level, offering something alternative. What would it be like to turn toward that and say, all right, am I blind? And would I like to see? And would I like to go through life with the kind of humility that says I might be wrong? But also not just like in a postmodern Gen X kind of, there's no truth, I might be wrong. That's more my tendency. But not only admitting I might be wrong, but desiring I'd like to see more clearly. I'd like to see the truth of things as best I can in my own limitations. I'd like to know what's true. I'd like to know what's true with the environment. What's really true? What's the cost? What are we really doing? Is there anything any of us can do about it? What's the truth about my neighbor? What's the truth about relationships? What's the truth about American politics? Just start going down the list, desiring in a humble way to see more clearly, which requires, I think, first admitting that we're blind. That's what I think Jesus is poking around in. So let's go back to the original story, because there's a backstory to it with the double healing. So the backstory is this. According to Mark, I think, little historical detail, not a disciple, Mark. So he's like, he's at least a generation away from the story. Mark says that there are two feeding incidents. I don't know why I called them incidents. I didn't know what to call them. Feeding things. Miracles or events. We'll just go with incidents. And in one of them, they pick up 12 baskets of leftovers. You've maybe heard this when you were a kid. If not, I'm telling it to you now. And then Jesus heals another bunch of people, and there are 7 baskets left over. Okay? If you're Jewish, you're much more interested in these numbers. You're like, wait a minute, what is going on here? And so then they get into a boat after these 2 stories. And they're going across the lake, it says. And Jesus says, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. And of course, the disciples are like, what the heck are you talking about? This is my translation. What are you talking about? Is it because we have no bread? And Jesus says to them, how many basketfuls were left over when I fed the 5,000? They say 12. And he says, well, what about the 4,000? They say 7. Then he says to them, do you still not see? And the answer is, no. Then they land at Bethsaida, and they meet a guy, and he half heals the man, only to heal him a few minutes later. So the man is a symbol of who? The disciples who half see. Who half see. Which is almost the worst predicament to be in. If you're blind, you're blind. If you half see, and I think that's the situation that we're in. And I think that's the situation, if I can make a grand statement, that America is in. I'm not saying, I'm not going to start protesting the fact that people kneel in the end zone, whatever they're doing. I don't know if they're thanking Jesus or something. I imagine they're not resting. I'm not going to start saying that that's wrong, or, I'm saying you can see and half see at the same time. And that's what life is like. I guess I should speak personally. That's what my life is like. I kind of half see the picture. And the question is, I think, for me, and what I'd like to at least suggest as we kind of maybe poke at some of these teachings of Jesus, is what way can we, as a culture even, and as a community here that's interested in transformation, turn towards some of those things and say, yeah, I can't see very well. What do I need to open my eyes to? And the moment you do that, you almost feel a kind of defeat. I do. All right. And it's at that moment of defeat that you start to see again. That's the great paradox. The moment you say, I am blind, is the moment the door opens just a little crack. And I think, at least in my view, that's a little seed, a dandelion seed, that goes way back 2,000 years. It's still floating in the wind. Thank you.